The radio operator at 15th Army headquarters near Calais listened to the Allied transmissions on the night of June 5, 1944. Static crackled through his headset as coded messages filled the airwaves, exactly the pattern intelligence had warned would precede an invasion. Across the Strait of Dover, barely 21 miles away, General George Patton's massive 1st United States Army Group was preparing to strike. At least, that's what every piece of German intelligence indicated. When the Allied invasion came at dawn the next morning, it landed not at Calais, but at beaches in Normandy, 140 miles to the southwest. In the war rooms of Berlin and Paris, German commanders studied their maps with satisfaction, tinged with relief. The Normandy assault involved only limited forces. The real blow, the main invasion everyone had anticipated for months, remained poised across from Calais under Patton's command. Adolf Hitler himself expressed confidence in this assessment. His intelligence services had tracked Patton's movements for months through aerial reconnaissance, intercepted radio communications, and reports from agents in England. The American general's presence at Dover meant one thing: the shortest route across the Channel, the natural path into the heart of Germany, would be the site of the true invasion. What the Germans didn't know was that Patton's army didn't exist. The 1st United States Army Group was the most elaborate deception operation in military history. Across the fields of Kent and Essex, inflatable tanks sat in neat formations visible from the air. Wooden landing craft bobbed in harbors along the southeastern coast. Radio operators transmitted thousands of messages, simulating the communications of a massive force preparing for invasion. Double agents fed carefully crafted intelligence to their German handlers. The entire apparatus existed for one purpose: to convince German high command that Patton, the general they feared most, was waiting to strike at Calais. And for the critical weeks of summer 1944, as Allied forces struggled to expand their foothold in Normandy, the deception worked. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, kept the 15th Army frozen in place near Calais. These divisions, comprising some of Germany's best troops and armor, waited for an invasion that would never come. When his subordinates reported the intense fighting in Normandy and suggested reinforcements, Rundstedt resisted. The Normandy landings, he believed, were precisely what Allied deception wanted him to think: the main effort. Logic, geography, and intelligence all pointed to Calais. Patton was still in England. The real invasion hadn't happened yet. This belief persisted not for days, but for weeks. Double agents, particularly one codenamed Garbos, who the Germans trusted implicitly, continued sending reports that Normandy was merely a diversion. The actual invasion force under Patton, they reported, was growing larger and preparing for the decisive blow. German reconnaissance confirmed these reports. Equipment continued arriving in southeastern England, radio traffic remained intense, and Patton himself had been photographed inspecting troops near Dover. The deception survived even when its premise began to crack. When Allied forces needed to explain why Patton might appear in Normandy during July, the cover story evolved. Patton had quarreled with British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and been demoted, given command of the lesser 3rd United States Army as punishment. His replacement at the 1st United States Army Group would continue preparing for the Calais invasion. But by late July, reality could no longer be ignored. On August 1st, at noon, Patton's Third Army became operational. The units weren't arriving from England, they were already in France, and they'd been fighting for days. The American breakout from Normandy had begun a week earlier with Operation Cobra, a massive assault that shattered German defensive lines near Saint-Lô. When Third Army poured through the gap at Avranches on July 30th, the fiction of the Phantom Army Group collapsed. The general the Germans had been watching in England was in France. The force they'd been waiting for at Calais was racing across Normandy. Everything their intelligence had told them for 8 months had been a lie. General Günther von Kluge, who had replaced Rundstedt as Commander-in-Chief West in early July, watched the American spearheads slice through French countryside at speeds German forces hadn't achieved since 1940. Patton's armored divisions advanced 40 miles in a single day, exploiting broken German lines with exactly the kind of bold, aggressive maneuver that German panzer doctrine championed. This, Kluge realized with growing dread, was what they should have expected. This was what Patton did. Hitler, rather than authorizing the retreat Kluge desperately requested, ordered a counterattack. Operation Lüttich would drive from Mortain west to the coast at Avranches, cutting off Patton's forces and restoring the German front. The offensive required 8 panzer divisions. Kluge could scrape together only 4, mustering about 300 tanks total. They attacked in darkness on August 7th. Within 3 days, the counter-offensive had failed completely. American artillery, anti-tank defenses, and fighter bombers destroyed over 100 German tanks. Patton's forces, rather than being cut off, were already racing east toward Le Mans, threatening to encircle the very German units trying to cut them off. On August 8th, Kluge sent increasingly frantic messages to Berlin. The entire German position in Normandy was being outflanked. Immediate withdrawal was essential. Hitler refused. Press the attack, he ordered. The counter-offensive would continue. The decision was catastrophic. While German forces remained committed to a failed offensive, American and British units closed around them from both sides. The Falaise pocket, a killing ground 12 miles wide, became the escape route for German forces fleeing east. Artillery and air attacks turned the gap into a charnel house. Some 100,000 German soldiers managed to escape, but they left behind mountains of destroyed equipment and thousands of dead. Those who survived would spend the coming months being pursued, outmaneuvered, and defeated by the very general they'd been told was still waiting in England. In the German officer corps, understanding came in stages. The first realization was tactical. Patton's Third Army was in France and moving with terrifying speed. The second was strategic. The entire Calais deception had been false, which meant German dispositions had been wrong for months. The third realization, which settled in as Patton's forces swept across France in August, was more personal and more troubling. This was the general they'd feared all along, and he was exactly as dangerous as they'd believed. Captain Oskar Steiger, a German intelligence officer, noted in his diary that Patton's movements showed what he called a second sight for armored warfare. The American general anticipated German responses, positioned his forces to exploit weaknesses before those weaknesses fully developed, and maintained offensive momentum that left defenders constantly reacting rather than planning. It was, Steiger wrote, the kind of operational art that German commanders had perfected in Poland and France. Seeing it used against them by an American was deeply unsettling. The pattern repeated throughout August and into September. Patton's Third Army captured city after city. Le Mans on August 8th, Chartres on August 16th, Orléans on August 16th, the Loire River crossings by August 20th. His forces covered 400 miles in 1 month, a pace of advance that German armies hadn't sustained since the opening weeks of Barbarossa against the Soviet Union. Field Marshal Walter Model, brought in to replace Kluge on August 17th, was Germany's expert at defensive warfare. Known as Hawash-Wat, for his ability to stabilize collapsing fronts on the Eastern Front, Model specialized in conducting fighting withdrawals that preserved forces for future operations. Against Patton's pursuit across France, even Model's expertise barely sufficed. Third Army moved faster than German units could withdraw, forcing Model into a headlong retreat that abandoned northern France almost entirely. By the end of August, Allied forces had liberated Paris and stood on the German border in some sectors. The Normandy campaign, which Hitler had vowed to turn into the Allies' graveyard, had become the destruction of German military power in the West. When the war ended and German commanders were interrogated, a different kind of testimony emerged. The wartime assessments, the intelligence reports, the operational analyses all documented what Patton had done. The post-war statements revealed what German commanders thought of who he was. General Günther Blumentritt, who had served as chief of staff to both Rundstedt and Kluge, put it most directly in a study he wrote for the United States Army. The Germans, he explained, regarded Patton extremely highly as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies. His operations impressed them enormously, probably because he came closest to the German concept of the classical military commander. Blumentritt went further. Patton had improved on Napoleon's principle of activity and speed. He'd taken the basic tenet and accelerated it beyond what even the originator had envisioned. This was high praise from an officer who'd helped plan the invasions of Poland and France, who'd watched Blitzkrieg evolve from theory to doctrine to operational reality. General Alfred Jodl, who served as Hitler's chief of operations throughout the war, was asked in interrogation about Allied commanders. His assessment of Patton was succinct. The comparison to Heinz Guderian, the Wehrmacht's master of armored warfare and creator of German panzer doctrine, represented perhaps the highest compliment one armored commander could give another. Jodl elaborated. Patton was very bold and preferred large movements. He took big risks and won big successes. When Guderian himself was questioned after the war, the conversation turned to Patton, the man who'd commanded the Panzer thrust through France in 1940, who'd driven deep into the Soviet Union in 1941, who'd personally pioneered the tactics and operational concepts that defined modern armored warfare, acknowledged his American counterpart. He'd heard much about Patton, Guderian said, and from the standpoint of a tank specialist, he had to congratulate him. Patton had acted as Guderian himself would have done in the same position. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who'd commanded German forces in Italy and then in the West, offered his own analysis. Patton had developed tank warfare into an art, Kesselring said, and understood how to handle tanks brilliantly in the field. The comparison Kesselring felt compelled to make was to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who'd likewise mastered the art of tank warfare. Both men, Kesselring judged, possessed a kind of second sight regarding armored operations. Perhaps the most telling assessment came from Rundstedt himself. In an interview for Stars and Stripes, shortly after his capture, the old field marshal was asked about Allied commanders. His response was characteristically brief. "He is your best." These statements, delivered after defeat, after the campaigns were over and the outcome decided, carried weight precisely because they came without strategic purpose. German commanders had nothing to gain by praising their conquerors. Their assessments reflected professional judgment about a fellow practitioner of their craft. What made these testimonies particularly striking was what they revealed about the evolution of German understanding. During the war, as Harry Yide's research into German military archives demonstrated, Patton's name hardly appeared in operational reports before August 1944. German commanders in Tunisia in early 1943 seemed barely aware of who he was. The Sicily campaign later that year left them unimpressed. Even the elaborate fortitude deception worked partly because German intelligence genuinely hadn't focused on Patton as intensely as Allied planners assumed. The respect, the fear, the careful attention all came after. They came when Third Army exploded out of Normandy in August 1944 and demonstrated what an aggressive armored commander with adequate resources and operational freedom could achieve. They came when German officers watched their defensive plans systematically dismantled by an opponent who thought like they did, who moved like they did, who understood armored warfare with the same instinctive clarity they'd cultivated through years of study and combat. The irony was profound. The Allies had built an elaborate deception around the premise that Germans feared Patton above all other Allied commanders. The deception worked, but the premise had been largely false. In mid-1944, German commanders were more concerned about Montgomery, more focused on Bradley, more uncertain about Eisenhower. Then Patton actually took the field, and the premise became reality. Fritz Bayerlein, who'd commanded Panzer Division and fought against British forces at El Alamein, offered his own bitter observation. After watching Montgomery's methodical pursuit allow Rommel's Afrika Korps to escape from Egypt in late 1942, Bayerlein was asked if the same escape would have succeeded against different opponents. His answer was pointed. This pattern of assessment, of professional respect tinged with genuine concern, appeared repeatedly in German post-war testimony. When officers described Allied commanders, they used different frameworks for different men. Montgomery was systematic but predictable. Bradley was competent but cautious. Eisenhower was an organizer more than a field commander. Patton was different. Patton was dangerous. The danger lay not just in his aggression or his speed, but in his understanding of operational art. German commanders recognized someone who'd studied their own doctrine, who'd absorbed the lessons of modern armored warfare, and who'd synthesized that knowledge into his own approach. He wasn't merely imitating German methods. He'd refined them, adapting Blitzkrieg concepts to American industrial capacity and tactical doctrine. This recognition carried an element of respect, but also frustration. Germany had spent the 1920s and 1930s developing armor doctrine when other nations clung to static defensive thinking. The Wehrmacht had demonstrated in Poland and France what concentrated armor could achieve when properly employed. That an American general had absorbed these lessons and then used them to devastating effect against their own forces represented a kind of tactical comeuppance. The summer of 1944 marked a transition point in the war. Before Normandy, German forces had fought with the confidence that superior tactics and operational skill could compensate for Allied material advantages. After Patton's breakout, that confidence evaporated. The Allies now had a commander who could match German operational thinking while wielding vastly superior resources. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who later commanded 5th Panzer Army against Patton during the Battle of the Bulge, acknowledged this shift. The Americans, he noted, had learned from their early encounters with German forces. By late 1944, they fought with growing sophistication, combining armor, infantry, artillery, and air power in ways that resembled German combined arms doctrine. Patton's Third Army, Manteuffel said, exemplified this evolution. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provided a final demonstration. When German forces launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes, Patton's response became legendary in both American and German military circles. Within 72 hours, he disengaged 3 divisions from active combat, rotated them 90 degrees, and sent them racing north to relieve the surrounded American forces at Bastogne. The maneuver required extraordinary staff work, precise timing, and aggressive execution. German commanders watching the movement recognized it immediately as the kind of rapid operational reorientation that they'd specialized in during earlier campaigns. Model, commanding the German forces in the Bulge, knew what it meant. Patton had arrived, and the offensive's southern flank was now under threat from exactly the kind of armored counterattack that could turn a German advance into a disaster. When Allied intelligence officers interviewed captured German officers after the Bulge, many expressed surprise not at Patton's relief of Bastogne, but at the speed with which he'd accomplished it. This was the warfare they understood, executed at a tempo that matched or exceeded their own capabilities. In the final months of the war, as Third Army drove into Germany itself, the pattern continued. German forces fought desperate defensive actions, trying to preserve what remained of their military power. Against Montgomery's methodical advance in the north and Bradley's steady pressure in the center, they could sometimes organize effective resistance. Against Patton's drives, they found themselves constantly outpaced, outmaneuvered, and outfought. The end came in May 1945. Germany surrendered, the Third Reich collapsed, and the commanders who'd fought on both sides began the long process of analyzing what had happened. For German officers, particularly those who'd faced Patton, the analysis involved acknowledging a truth that would have seemed impossible in 1943 or early 1944. The Americans had produced a commander who understood armored warfare as well as they did. Blumentrit's final assessment captured this recognition. Writing years after the war, he reflected on the commanders he'd faced during 6 years of conflict. The British had produced capable generals, methodical and professional. The Soviets had developed increasingly effective commanders as the war progressed. But among the Americans, Blumentritt wrote, Patton stood apart. He possessed the combination of aggressive instinct, tactical brilliance, and operational vision that defined the greatest commanders of armored warfare. The statement carried particular weight because it came from a man who'd helped plan the invasions that demonstrated what armored warfare could achieve, who'd witnessed the evolution of German tactical doctrine, who'd seen firsthand what happened when that doctrine was turned against its creators. In the summer of 1944, when German generals realized that Patton was real and coming for them, they understood they faced not just an enemy, but a challenge to their professional identity. For years, German forces had dominated European battlefields through superior tactics and operational skill. Now an American general was beating them at their own game. The realization didn't come all at once. It built through accumulated evidence. The speed of the Normandy breakout, the precision of Third Army's movements, the aggressive exploitation of opportunities that German doctrine would have prescribed. Each engagement, each maneuver, each operation added to the understanding that this opponent was different. When Rundstedt said Patton was the Allies' best, he wasn't speaking from sentiment or attempting flattery. He was delivering a professional assessment based on having faced multiple Allied commanders under various circumstances. The judgment reflected what he and his fellow officers had learned through hard experience in France. The deception that kept German forces waiting at Calais while the real invasion landed elsewhere represented an intelligence failure of historic proportions. But the deeper failure, the more personally troubling one for German commanders, was in underestimating what Patton would do once unleashed. Allied intelligence had assumed Germans feared him. The irony was that they hadn't feared him enough, not until they saw what he could accomplish with an entire army and the freedom to use it. The final testimony came not from formal interrogations, but from private conversations among captured German officers. American intelligence personnel, listening to these discussions, noted a recurring theme. When German commanders talked among themselves about Allied generals, about the campaigns in France and Germany, about what had gone wrong and why, Patton's name appeared repeatedly. They spoke of him with the kind of frustrated respect that professionals reserve for opponents who've genuinely outperformed them. They analyzed his methods, discussed his techniques, tried to understand how an American had absorbed and then exceeded their own doctrine. The conversations revealed men grappling with a truth that challenged their assumptions about German military superiority. In the end, what German generals said when they realized Patton was real and coming for them evolved across 3 stages. First came the shock of recognition. The Phantom Army had been a fiction, and the general they'd been told was in England was actually tearing through France. Then came the tactical acknowledgement. This opponent understood armored warfare at a level that demanded serious respect. Finally came the post-war assessment. Among Allied commanders, this was the one who'd fought like a German general at the height of German tactical skill. Blumentritt perhaps expressed it most completely in a statement that combined professional admiration with the bitter knowledge of defeat. Patton, he wrote, came closest to the German concept of the classical military commander. This wasn't merely acknowledging competence. This was recognizing a peer, someone who understood warfare the way they did, who'd studied the same principles and reached the same conclusions about how armored forces should be employed. The recognition came too late to change the outcome. By the time German commanders fully appreciated what Patton represented, The Normandy campaign was lost, France was being liberated, and the road to Berlin lay open. But the acknowledgement mattered, not for the war's outcome, but for what it revealed about the evolution of American military capability. In 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, German commanders believed they faced industrially superior but tactically inferior opponents. By the war's end, they knew better. They'd encountered an American general who could fight the way they fought, think the way they thought, and execute operations that matched or exceeded their own standards. What they said when they realized Patton was real and coming for them was, ultimately, what any professional says when facing a superior opponent: acknowledgement, respect, and the grim determination to do their duty even when facing defeat. But underneath those professional courtesies ran a current of genuine recognition. This general, this army, this campaign represented something new in American military history. The Americans had finally produced a commander who made German generals worry.